The doorbell rang twice in quick succession, the way doorbells ring when the person on the other side already knows you're home and isn't planning to wait long, and I watched my father's face go white before he'd even reached the front hallway. My name is Natalie. I'm 32 years old, a senior forensic accountant, soon to become director of forensic accounting at a firm in Hartford, Connecticut, and I was standing in my parents' dining room on Thanksgiving Day, half a glass of wine in my hand, when two FBI agents walked through my parents' front door and arrested my older sister in front of 18 members of our extended family. I'd spent my entire career learning to read financial documents the way other people read facial expressions, finding the inconsistency buried 3 pages deep, the number that didn't reconcile. The story a spreadsheet told when you stopped believing what you'd been told it meant. I had used exactly those skills 8 months earlier to tell my parents that my sister's company was very likely a fraud. They hadn't believed me. They'd believed her. My sister, Sienna, 35 years old, stood at the head of my parents' dining table that Thanksgiving in a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. Mid-sentence in some story about her company's latest funding round, when Agent Renee Castillo stepped into the doorway of the dining room with another agent beside her and said, simply, "Sienna Cross, you're under arrest for securities fraud and wire fraud." The room didn't gasp the way rooms do in movies. It went silent in a different way, a thick, suspended silence, the kind that happens when 20 people simultaneously realize they're watching something that cannot be undone. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. My father stood frozen in the hallway, the front door still open behind him, letting in cold November air that nobody moved to stop. I didn't stand up. I didn't gasp. I sat very still at the far end of the table, my wine glass halfway to my mouth, and felt something inside me that I would spend the rest of that evening, and many evenings after, trying to name, not triumph, not quite. Something closer to the strange, hollow stillness of finally watching a structure you'd warned everyone about collapse exactly the way you'd predicted, with none of the satisfaction you might have expected and all of the grief you hadn't. I want to take you back, though, because this moment, Sienna being led out of our parents' house in handcuffs past the Thanksgiving centerpiece she'd insisted on ordering from an expensive florist 3 weeks earlier, didn't begin that afternoon. It began decades before, in the particular architecture of a family that had organized itself, for as long as I could remember, around one daughter's brilliance and the other daughter's usefulness. I was the second daughter. I want to be precise about what that meant in my family, because I think people sometimes hear less favored sibling and imagine something dramatic, overt cruelty, obvious neglect. What I experienced was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to point to, which is exactly what made it so difficult to ever fully name. Sienna had always been the one who lit up a room. Charismatic from childhood, effortlessly likable, the kind of person teachers remembered fondly even years after she'd graduated their classes, regardless of how she'd actually performed academically. I was competent. Steady. The daughter who got things right rather than the daughter who made everyone feel good simply by being present. My parents, Donna and Edward, organized their attention accordingly, though neither of them would have described it that way if you'd asked them directly. Sienna's achievements, even modest ones, were celebrated extensively, recounted to relatives, framed in ways that made them sound larger than they often were. My own accomplishments, including a master's degree in forensic accounting completed while working full-time, a CPA license earned on the first attempt, a steadily advancing career built entirely on merit rather than charm, were acknowledged briefly, and then the conversation would, inevitably, find its way back to Sienna. I told myself, for most of my adult life, that this didn't matter, that competence and hard work would eventually earn the recognition charisma had always claimed more easily. I believed, with a conviction I never fully examined, that if I simply kept being right, kept being reliable, kept demonstrating my value through results rather than performance, my parents would eventually see me the way I wanted to be seen. That belief would cost me more than I understood, sitting at that Thanksgiving table 8 months after I'd first warned my family about exactly what was coming. Sienna's company, a wellness technology startup called La Mera, launched roughly 2 years before that Thanksgiving, built around a subscription platform that promised to combine personalized supplement formulations with an app-based coaching system. I remember the pitch she gave at a family dinner shortly after the company's founding, polished, confident, full of the kind of optimistic projections that sound impressive if you don't know how to read the assumptions underneath them. I knew how to read those assumptions. That was, after all, my profession. I didn't say much that evening. I asked a few careful questions about customer acquisition costs, about the realism of her projected growth curve, about how exactly the supplement manufacturing and fulfillment logistics would scale, and watched Sienna deflect each question with the same easy charm she'd always used to navigate any moment of scrutiny, redirecting toward vision and passion rather than addressing the specifics I'd raised. My parents watched this exchange with visible discomfort, not at Sienna's vagueness, but at what they clearly experienced as my unsupportive skepticism. "Can you just be happy for your sister?" my mother said to me in the kitchen afterward, her voice carrying the particular note of disappointment I'd grown fluent in reading over 3 decades. I told her I was happy for Sienna. I told her my questions weren't about doubting her sister's potential, but about wanting the business itself to succeed on solid footing. I believed that mostly. I also recognized, even then, the familiar shape of being cast as the difficult one for simply asking the questions my professional training made automatic. I didn't push further that night. I told myself Sienna's company was young, that early-stage businesses often had rough projections that would sharpen with experience, that my concerns, while professionally valid, didn't necessarily mean anything was actually wrong. That assumption would prove costly within the year. About 8 months after Lumira's launch, my parents called a family meeting, an unusual enough event in itself that I should have registered it as significant before I even arrived. Sitting in their living room, Sienna presented what she described as an extraordinary opportunity. Lumira had attracted serious investor interest, but needed additional capital to bridge to the next funding round. And she was asking immediate family to consider investing alongside outside investors who, she said, were already committed. I watched my parents' faces as Sienna spoke and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the wine I'd had at dinner. I asked, as carefully as I could, to see the actual financial statements, revenue figures, burn rate, the terms being offered to outside investors. Sienna provided a polished one-page summary that I recognized immediately, professionally, as designed to obscure rather than reveal the underlying numbers. "This isn't a full financial picture," I said. "I'd need actual statements, not a projection summary, before I could responsibly tell you this is a sound investment." Sienna's expression flickered, something quick, defensive, gone almost before I'd registered it. "I'm not asking you to audit me, Natalie. I'm asking for family support." I noted that flicker. I filed it away as simple sibling friction, Sienna's familiar resistance to my professional scrutiny, rather than what it actually was, the first visible crack in a story that wouldn't hold up to real examination. My parents, in the weeks that followed, made the decision, without consulting me further, without requesting the actual financial documentation I'd asked for, to invest their entire retirement fund. Just over $500,000 accumulated across 35 years of careful saving into Lumira. I found out after the transfer had already been made. My father called to tell me, his voice carrying a note of excited pride I hadn't heard from him in connection with anything I'd ever accomplished. "We believe in your sister," he said. "Sometimes you have to bet on family." I sat with the phone against my ear, feeling something cold settle into my stomach, and said, as gently as I could manage, "Dad, I need you to understand the risk here. Without real financial transparency, I can't tell you this is sound. I think you should talk to me before committing anymore." "We've already decided, Natalie," he said. "I hope you can be supportive of this." I hung up the phone that evening and sat alone in my apartment for a long time, feeling the familiar ache of being right about something nobody wanted to hear and being dismissed not despite my expertise, but in some confusing way. Almost because of it, as if my professional caution made me the obstacle rather than the safeguard. The unease that had been building since that initial family meeting didn't fade in the months that followed. It sharpened, gradually, into something closer to genuine alarm, even as I continued, for reasons I'm still working to fully understand, to hold back from pushing as hard as my training told me I should. Sienna's public presentation of Lumira's success accelerated dramatically over the following months. Social media posts about new funding milestones. A glossy magazine feature describing her as a rising star in the wellness tech space. A larger office space in a converted warehouse downtown that she gave the family a tour of, walking us through open-plan workspaces occupied by a smaller number of actual employees than the tour seemed designed to suggest. I noticed, during that tour, something that struck me as professionally significant even though I couldn't articulate exactly why at the time. Several of the desks I walked past had no personal items, no signs of regular use, despite Sienna introducing the space as fully staffed and operational. I mentioned this, carefully, to my mother afterward. "Some of those desks looked unused," I said. "Is the company actually at the headcount Sienna's describing?" My mother's response was immediate and sharp. "Why do you always have to find something wrong, Natalie? Can you just be proud of her for once?" I let the observation go. I told myself I might be misreading an ordinary detail. Maybe some employees worked remotely. Maybe the tour had simply caught an unusual day. I recognize now, with the clarity that comes only after everything fell apart, that I was beginning to do something dangerous, discounting my own professional instincts specifically because acting on them would mean, once again, becoming the difficult daughter who couldn't simply be happy for her sister. There was a phone call, about 4 months before Thanksgiving, when Sienna called asking whether I might help her clean up some of the investor reporting language for an upcoming presentation, a request that, on its surface, sounded like a reasonable ask between siblings with complementary skills. I agreed to look at the documents she sent over. What I found unsettled me more than I let myself fully register at the time. The investor reports contained revenue figures that didn't reconcile with the bank statement summaries also included in the same document package, a discrepancy any first-year auditor would have flagged immediately. I called Sienna to ask about it. "It's just a formatting error," she said, too quickly, her voice carrying a brittleness I'd rarely heard from her. "I'll have my bookkeeper fix it before this goes out." I accepted that explanation, even though some part of me recognized, even in the moment, that the speed and slight panic in her response didn't quite match the casualness of a simple formatting mistake. I told myself I was being overly suspicious, that my profession had trained me to see fraud patterns everywhere, even in situations that were simply messy rather than malicious. I didn't escalate my concerns further with my parents at that point. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me had grown tired of being the family's perpetual skeptic, tired of watching my warnings dismissed while Sienna's reassurances were accepted without question. I told myself that continuing to push would only further cement my role as the difficult sister, without actually changing anything, since my parents had already shown they trusted Sienna's account over mine. That was, I understand now, a costly miscalculation, not because pushing harder would necessarily have stopped what was coming, but because my own silence, born from exhaustion rather than genuine reassurance, became one more piece of the structure that allowed Sienna's fraud to continue unchecked for several more months. It was around this time, examining the discrepancy in those investor reports more carefully on my own, that I began noticing something in Sienna's behavior during family gatherings that struck me as different from her usual easy confidence, small, almost imperceptible signs I'd later recognize as the visible edges of mounting internal pressure she was working hard to conceal. At a dinner about 3 months before Thanksgiving, I watched her excuse herself from the table twice to take phone calls she described, both times, as just investor stuff, nothing important, though her hand, when she returned the second time, trembled slightly as she picked her wine glass back up, a detail I noticed and then consciously set aside as simple stress rather than anything more significant. I didn't know it then, but Sienna had been carrying considerably more than ordinary business stress during those months. She told me much later what had actually been happening during that period. Those calls were from a lead investor who'd started asking pointed questions about quarterly revenue figures that didn't match what I'd reported the previous quarter. I'd go into the bathroom or step outside and feel my whole chest tighten, trying to figure out which lie I'd already told that I now needed to keep consistent. Every family dinner during those months, I was performing two different versions of reality simultaneously: the confident founder my parents needed to see, and the person underneath who was beginning to understand, with real fear, that the gap between what I'd promised investors and what the company actually had was growing faster than I could manage. I told myself every single time that I just needed one more good quarter to bridge the gap honestly. I never got one. I didn't know any of that at the time, of course. I just registered the trembling hand, the slightly too quick reassurance, and filed it away as one more detail I didn't fully understand and chose not to pursue. The final months before Thanksgiving brought a level of internal pressure I hadn't anticipated, not from external investigation, but from my own growing certainty that something was seriously wrong, colliding with my exhaustion at being repeatedly dismissed whenever I raised concerns. I started losing sleep in a way that surprised me, given that I wasn't even the one with direct financial exposure to Lumira's fate. I'd lie awake reconstructing the discrepancies I'd noticed in those investor reports, running scenarios in my head about what they might actually mean. Unable to fully convince myself I was overreacting and equally unable to act decisively on my suspicions. About 6 weeks before Thanksgiving, I finally did something I should have done months earlier. I used professional databases available through my firm to research Lumira's actual regulatory filings and any public records connected to its fundraising activity. What I found stopped me cold, sitting alone in my office on a Saturday afternoon when the building was otherwise empty. Lumira had filed offering documents with several investors that described revenue figures and growth metrics substantially inflated beyond what any legitimate operational data could support, given the company's actual size and customer base, which I was able to estimate through publicly available business registration and employment records. The discrepancy wasn't simple optimistic rounding, it was the kind of systematic misrepresentation that, in my professional experience, indicated deliberate fraud rather than enthusiastic exaggeration. I sat with that realization for a long time, the office silent around me, feeling the particular vertigo of understanding that my sister was very likely committing securities fraud, using our parents' entire retirement savings as part of the foundation for a scheme that could destroy not just her own future, but theirs as well. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to the rest of the story. Even with this evidence in hand, I hesitated to act immediately. I told myself I needed to be certain that accusing my sister of outright fraud based on database research, without direct access to her actual books, risked being not just professionally reckless, but personally devastating if I was somehow wrong. That hesitation cost valuable time. But it also reflected something deeper I'm still working to fully understand about myself. A lifetime of being dismissed had made me, paradoxically, more cautious about asserting my professional judgment within my own family than I would have been with any client or colleague. I called my grandfather, Walter, during this period, the one family member who had always taken my professional opinions seriously, who'd encouraged my career from the beginning in a way my parents, distracted by Sienna's brighter light, never quite managed. He was 86 by then, living independently but slowing visibly, and I drove to see him rather than discussing something this serious over the phone. He listened to everything I'd found, his expression growing graver with each detail, and then he said something I've returned to many times since. "Natalie, you've spent your whole life being right and not being believed. I won't pretend I know exactly what to do here, but I trust your judgment more than I trust your sister's charm, and more than I trust your parents' wishful thinking. Whatever you decide to do, I'm behind you." That conversation gave me something I hadn't had in months: permission to trust my own clear-eyed assessment over my family's preferred version of reality. I went to my parents directly, 2 weeks later, with everything I'd found: the regulatory filing discrepancies, the unreconciled investor reports. My professional assessment that Lumira's public financial story didn't match what any legitimate company at its actual size could support. I laid it out as carefully and unemotionally as I could manage, the way I'd present findings to any client facing a difficult truth. My father's response was immediate and dismissive. "You've never liked that your sister succeeds at things more easily than you do," he said. "I think that's coloring your judgment here, Natalie, whether you realize it or not." I felt something in me go very still at that, not quite anger, but a kind of devastating clarity about exactly how my family had always processed my professional caution, not as expertise, but as jealousy dressed up in spreadsheets. "This isn't about jealousy, Dad," I said. "This is what fraud looks like. I'm telling you this because I love you and I don't want to watch you lose everything you've worked for." My mother, sitting beside him, reached for his hand. "We trust Sienna," she said simply, as if trust were sufficient evidence against documented regulatory filings. I left that conversation with a sick, hollow feeling that stayed with me for days, not surprise, exactly, since some part of me had expected this response, but a fresh, specific grief at watching my parents choose, explicitly and consciously, their preferred narrative over the documented reality I'd presented. There was a moment, about 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, when I almost called Sienna directly to confront her myself, the accusation already forming in my mind. I picked up my phone, her contact pulled up, my thumb hovering over the call button. I set the phone down without dialing. I told myself I needed more certainty before that confrontation, that whatever I said to her directly might simply give her time to cover her tracks further before whatever consequences were already, I increasingly suspected, moving toward her regardless of anything I did. I didn't know, at that point, exactly how close those consequences already were. I would learn, only weeks later, that federal investigators had already begun examining Lumira's investor reporting months earlier, following a complaint from one of the outside investors whose own due diligence had uncovered inconsistencies similar to what I'd found independently. Thanksgiving arrived 2.5 weeks after that final, devastating conversation with my parents. I almost didn't go. I sat in my apartment that morning seriously considering whether I could manage an entire day pretending everything was normal, watching my family continue to celebrate a company I knew, with professional certainty, was very likely fraudulent. I went anyway, partly out of habit, partly because some part of me still hoped, against my own better judgment, that some version of honest reckoning might happen organically, without me having to force it. The dinner proceeded normally enough for the first hour. 18 people gathered around my parents' extended dining table, the familiar smells of roasted turkey and my mother's particular sage stuffing, Aunt Vivian and Uncle Ben catching up with cousins. Mrs. Carmody and her husband Bill, longtime family friends, settled comfortably near the end of the table. Sienna, seated at the head near our father, was in full performance mode, recounting Lumira's latest milestone, a supposed new round of institutional investment that, I now understood with grim certainty, almost certainly didn't exist in the form she was describing. I watched her tell this story with the same easy charisma I'd watched my entire life, and felt something hollow settle in my chest, watching everyone around the table nod along, charmed despite, or perhaps because of, the very confidence I now recognized as performance rather than substance. The doorbell rang during dessert. My father answered it, and I watched, from my seat at the far end of the table, his posture change completely, shoulders dropping, face draining of color, before Agent Renee Castillo and a second agent, whom I'd later learn was Agent Doyle, stepped into the dining room behind him. "Sienna Cross," Agent Castillo said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room, "you're under arrest for securities fraud and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." What happened next unfolded with a strange, dreamlike clarity I can still recall in precise detail. Sienna's face went through several rapid transformations, confusion first, genuine and immediate, followed almost instantly by something closer to panic as the reality of the moment landed. She stood up so quickly her chair toppled backward, and her first words, delivered in a voice pitched higher than I'd ever heard from her, weren't directed at the agents at all. "This is insane, Dad. Tell them. Dad knew about all of this. He approved the investor materials. My father's face, already pale, went through its own rapid transformation, shock giving way, within seconds, to something that looked almost like physical pain. "Sienna, what are you saying? You signed off on the projections, Dad. You knew the timeline was aggressive. You told me to make it work." Sienna's voice had risen to something approaching a shout now, her composure completely gone. The polished founder persona collapsed entirely into raw, cornered fear. Around the table, I watched the room's social architecture shift in real time, Aunt Vivian's hand flying to her mouth, several cousins exchanging stunned glances, Mrs. Carmody quietly gathering her husband's coat from the back of his chair. The unmistakable body language of guests calculating, with increasing urgency, how quickly they could leave without seeming to flee. Agent Castillo moved forward, beginning the formal process of restraining Sienna's hands while she continued talking, her words tumbling out faster now, less coherent, directed at our father with an intensity that made the rest of the room's presence seem almost incidental. "You can't do this in front of everyone," Sienna said, her voice cracking now, tears beginning to track down her face. "Dad, say something, tell them you were involved too." My father stood frozen in the doorway he'd opened for the agents, his own face crumbling into something I'd never witnessed from him before, not quite confession, but the unmistakable look of a man realizing, in real time, in front of his entire extended family, exactly how implicated he actually was. I didn't move from my seat. I want to be honest about that, because I know it might seem strange, even cold, but what I felt in that moment wasn't satisfaction, despite 8 months of being dismissed for warning exactly this would happen. It was something closer to a vast, quiet sorrow, watching my sister's entire constructed reality collapse in real time, watching my father's complicity surface in front of people who would carry the story for the rest of their lives. Understanding that nothing about this moment could actually be undone. My mother had gone completely silent, her hand pressed against her mouth, watching her older daughter being led toward the front door in handcuffs past a Thanksgiving table still covered with half-eaten pie. As Sienna passed near my end of the table, escorted by Agent Doyle, she turned toward me, the first time she'd looked directly at me since the agents had entered the room, and said, with a bitterness I'd never heard her direct at me before, "You knew. You've known for months, and you let this happen at Thanksgiving, in front of everyone." I met her eyes, and felt something in me hold steady despite the chaos around us. "I told you, and I told Mom and Dad 8 months ago that this was fraud," I said, my voice quiet but completely level. "I'm not the one who built this. I'm not the one who's responsible for how this ended." She didn't respond to that. The agents continued moving her toward the door, and within minutes, the house had emptied of nearly every guest except immediate family, the Thanksgiving table sitting abandoned with its half-finished plates and its toppled chair. The particular silence of a house that has just witnessed something it will never fully recover from settling over everything. The months following that Thanksgiving brought a cascade of consequences that unfolded with the particular relentlessness of a federal investigation gaining momentum. Sienna was formally charged within weeks, securities fraud, wire fraud, and several related counts connected to over $2.3 million misappropriated from investors who had believed, based on fabricated reports, that La Mera was a thriving, rapidly growing business. My father, it emerged through the investigation, had known considerably more than the role of supportive parent he'd presented to the rest of the family. He'd helped review and, in at least 2 documented instances, directly approved investor-facing materials he knew contained inflated figures, motivated, as the investigation's findings eventually made clear, by a desire to protect what he'd convinced himself was simply optimistic timing rather than outright fraud. He was indicted as a co-conspirator and ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, accepting a sentence that included both probation and significant financial penalties. My parents lost their home within the year, not directly seized as part of the criminal proceedings, but a consequence of having no retirement savings left to fall back on once legal fees, restitution obligations, and the simple practical collapse of their financial stability overwhelmed them. They moved into a small rental apartment across town, a fact I learned not from my mother directly, but from Aunt Vivian, who called me, her voice heavy with regret, several weeks after the arrest. "I should have listened to you years ago," Aunt Vivian said. "We all should have. I watched you get dismissed at every family gathering and I never said anything because it was easier to just go along with how everyone treated Sienna's success as more real than your warnings." "I'm sorry, Natalie. I really am." I appreciated her honesty, even as it arrived too late to change anything that had already happened. My mother called me about 2 months after the arrest, her voice smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever heard it. She'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. Allen, she told me, working through what she described, with visible difficulty, as her own role in years of favoritism that had shaped our family's dynamics long before Sienna's company ever existed. I don't expect you to forgive any of this quickly, she said. I just needed you to know I'm finally seeing it, really seeing it, not just saying the words. I spent your whole childhood treating your sister's confidence as more valuable than your confidence, and I think some part of me always knew that wasn't fair, and I let myself believe it didn't matter because you never complained the way she would have. I told her I appreciated her honesty, and that I needed time before I knew what rebuilding our relationship might actually look like. We've spoken more regularly since then, cautiously, in conversations that feel different than anything we managed before that Thanksgiving, more honest, if not yet entirely comfortable. I visited Sienna in prison about 6 months into her sentence, uncertain, until I was actually sitting across from her in the visiting room, whether I'd be able to maintain the composure I'd held since that Thanksgiving. She looked different, smaller somehow, the practiced confidence stripped away entirely, replaced by something rawer than I'd ever seen from her. I need to tell you the real version, she finally said, after several minutes of strained, surface-level conversation. Not the version I gave everyone, including myself, for 2 years. It started with one investor meeting, about 4 months after launch, where I realized our actual numbers were going to disappoint everyone who'd already committed verbally to the next round. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot afterward, and instead of calling them back to correct the timeline honestly, I told myself I just needed to round up slightly on the next report. Present the trajectory I genuinely believed we'd hit within another quarter or two, rather than where we actually were that month. I told myself this wasn't lying exactly. It was optimistic projection, the kind every founder uses to keep momentum going. That was the first lie, and once I'd told it, the next one came easier, because I'd already proven to myself I could do it without immediate consequences. Every quarter after that, the gap between what I'd promised and what we'd actually achieved grew a little wider, and I kept telling myself the same story, just one more good quarter, just one more round of funding. And I'd be able to make the real numbers match what I'd already reported. I brought Mom and Dad's retirement money in because I genuinely believed, at that point, that an infusion of trusted capital would buy me the runway to actually deliver on what I'd promised investors. I told myself this wasn't using them, it was including them in something I still believed, somewhere underneath all the lies, was going to work out. I think that's the part that's hardest to admit, Natalie. I wasn't entirely cynical. I believed my own story for longer than I should have, which somehow makes it worse, not better. By the time you came to Mom and Dad with the discrepancies you'd found, I knew you were right. I knew it completely. But admitting it would have meant unraveling everything at once, the company, the investors, Mom and Dad's money, the entire identity I'd built around being the daughter who succeeded easily, who didn't need to ask anyone for help the way you'd built your career asking nothing of anyone. I couldn't face becoming the daughter who'd failed that completely, in front of you, of all people. I should have stopped the moment you raised your concerns the first time. I knew that even then. I kept going instead, because stopping felt like a worse kind of death than continuing toward whatever was inevitably coming. When those agents walked into that dining room, some part of me felt almost relieved. Underneath the panic, relieved that I finally wasn't the only one carrying the weight of what I'd done. I sat across from my sister in that prison visiting room, feeling something complicated settle in my chest, not quite forgiveness, not yet, but something that felt like the beginning of understanding her as a fully human person rather than simply the family's golden child whose collapse I'd predicted and witnessed. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I finally said. "I don't know yet what comes next for us. But I needed to hear this version, not the performance. In the time since, I've made my own deliberate choices about how to move forward. I inherited my grandfather Walter's lake house after he passed peacefully about a year after that devastating Thanksgiving, and I kept it, not as an investment, not as something to sell for practical advantage, but as a physical space that represented the one relationship in my family that had never required me to prove my worth before offering me belonging. James, a carpenter I met through a friend's renovation project about 8 months after Sienna's sentencing, has become something steadier in my life than I expected during this particular chapter, not a rescue from my family's dysfunction, but evidence that the kind of straightforward, consistent regard I'd spent my whole life hoping to earn from my parents was actually available, freely, from people who simply valued me without requiring me to perform for it. I maintain firm boundaries now, no financial involvement with my parents' ongoing struggles, careful limits on how much of my own emotional labor goes toward managing the family's collective recovery. I allow cautious, gradual rebuilding where people demonstrate real accountability, and I no longer organize my own sense of worth around whether that rebuilding happens on anyone else's timeline but my own. I am still a forensic accountant, now a director, a promotion that arrived, with some irony I've made peace with. Partly because of the professional reputation I built specifically by being the person who reads the numbers correctly when everyone else prefers a more comfortable story. I am not the overlooked daughter who believed competence alone would eventually earn recognition anymore. I'm someone who finally understands that recognition you have to silently earn through endless rightness was never actually love in the first place. There's a particular kind of family pattern that's hardest to see because it doesn't announce itself as harm. It simply looks like preference, like personality, like one daughter being naturally easier to celebrate than the other. I spent decades not fully naming what that pattern cost me because it never looked like overt cruelty, and I understand now why that made it so difficult to confront directly. Confronting it meant admitting that being right, being capable, being reliable had never been enough to earn the same warmth charm had always claimed more easily. Looking back, the trembling hand around that wine glass, months before Thanksgiving, wasn't simply stress, it was the visible edge of a collapse already well underway. One I noticed and set aside because acknowledging it fully would have required confronting my family with something even more serious than my earlier financial concerns. I had pieces of this unraveling long before I had its full shape, and I understand now that I wasn't blind to those pieces so much as exhausted by a lifetime of having my clearest observations dismissed. The real turning point wasn't the arrest itself. Dramatic as it was the moment, weeks earlier, when my father told me my professional judgment was simply jealousy in disguise. I had spent 32 years believing that demonstrated competence would eventually outweigh charisma in my family's accounting of who deserved trust. What I learned, finally, watching my sister let out in handcuffs past a half-eaten Thanksgiving dinner, is that some families never recalculate that equation until the cost of not recalculating becomes undeniable, catastrophic, and entirely too late to prevent. I think, too, about my own silence in the months before that final confrontation with my parents, how my exhaustion at being dismissed had nearly cost me the chance to act on what I knew with growing certainty. That's a harder lesson to sit with than anything about my family's favoritism, because it means acknowledging that being chronically unheard can erode even a person's confidence in their own clear judgment. And that protecting your own voice sometimes means speaking up again, regardless of how many times it's been dismissed before. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about Sienna's fraud or even about my parents' favoritism. It was about how a family's preferred story can outweigh documented reality for years, right up until that story finally collapses under its own accumulated weight, and about how much it costs, both to the people who enable the story and the people whose warnings get dismissed in service of it, when nobody's willing to choose truth over comfort while there's still time to change course. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this. Notice when your clearest professional or personal judgment is being reframed repeatedly as jealousy, negativity, or an inability to simply be happy for someone else. That reframing is often easier for families to accept than the harder truth you're actually trying to tell them. You don't have to wait for federal agents at a holiday dinner to trust what you already know. I hope you don't have to. But if some part of this story sounded familiar, if some part of you recognized yourself in the daughter whose competence was never quite enough to be believed, let this be the moment you trust your own clear-eyed judgment, even when no one else is ready to. I'm not angry anymore most days. I'm something steadier than that now. Something that finally feels, after everything, entirely and quietly my own.